Yep, okay, thank you. Try not to cough on anyone here. Um, as Chris said, I do have a farm. I do farm. I put up a lot of fence. And when I thought about doing this topic, I just wanted to start with, like, what, if we were talking about building fence, what do we really want our fence to be? And this is the list of things I came up with. Someone else might have a different list, but I think it covers most of the facets of a fence that most people want. They want something that's visible so the animals see it, they don't go through it. Tall enough they can't get over it. Solid, strong, a robust fence. They'd like it to be inexpensive. Wouldn't that be nice, an inexpensive fence? I don't know that there's an inexpensive fence, but there's less and more expensive fences for sure. Low maintenance is as high on my priority list since I work this job that pays me on top of my farming job. I need something that I can do and manage. And I want it to last a long time. I tell people this all the time, that fencing is one of those projects on the farm that is very stressful. Sort of like working cattle. This is one of those things that causes strife in my marriage. So I want it to last a long time because I'm not planning to build another set of fences with my husband. I'm hoping my children will do it next time. In addition to having a desirable set of characteristics in the fence, everyone has biases, and I believe in electrified fencing. I strongly believe that I don't want to have animals that don't stay inside an electric fence. I don't want animals that don't have the temperament to learn. That's important to me. And so I am a believer in it. That doesn't mean that everyone is going to choose that type of fence. Everyone's going to prioritize these characteristics differently, and they're going to come up with a different solution, and that's okay. But one of the reasons that I'm a big believer in the electrified fencing is because we had a smaller tornado than the one that went through Princeton come through our farm in, it might have been 2018 or 2019, pretty early in our fencing schools, and it actually took out a house. And I had renters in the house, and they called me and said the roof was gone, and I thought they meant they'd lost shingles. And then I went out after the tornado had come through, and they'd really lost the roof and the joists and the rafters, and it was all in my alpaca pen. And what I thought was really wonderful about the fence is, aside from taking out a post, I knocked the roof off of the wire. That smooth wire popped back up. I turned on a solar box. My alpacas were in that night, and I didn't have to worry about them for the next day or two while I dealt with the people that were having a really major life issue. And the fence worked exactly how it was supposed to for me. And so I saw a lot of value in that type of fencing. But that's not to say that everyone's going to want that type of fence. It just happens to be something that I have a strong belief in. But there are a lot of different types of fences on the market. I do this talk a lot in central Kentucky where there's even higher pressure towards the wood plank fencing. As we move a little bit outside of central Kentucky, that's less desirable, but a lot of people still like a wood plank fence. They like the aesthetic of it. And depending on what they're doing and how they're managing their farm, it's part of the image of being a Kentucky farm. Is wood plank. So we're going to talk about that one first. Then we're going to talk about woven wire, fixed, not high tensile, what I call a smooth high tensile wire, and then a barbed wire fence. Barbed wire is typically high tensile at this point too. And as we go through all of them, I'm going to give you sort of my thoughts on the type of fence and then a cost comparison. I've used what's known as the Virginia Tech calculator there, and I have a link to it. It's in there. It's a very long link. It's basically a Excel spreadsheet that you can modify. It's extremely flexible. It allows you to put in different costs for different materials, assign different types of materials. I've done an assumption here that I have 1,000 foot of fence for each of these styles. I'm bracing both ends. All of my brace posts are going to be 8 foot long and 6 to 7 inch diameter posts. My line posts will be 7 or 7.5, 4 to 5 inch diameter posts. In a lot of cases, I've followed NRCS specs when I've done these designs, but I have gone and bumped up the size of the post for both the line and the corner post one size from what NRCS requires because I said before, I have a lifespan on this fence that I'm building, and I want it to last long enough that my children will be building the next one, not me. And so I don't think a 3.4 is going to give me the lifespan that I want out of my line post, so I've gone to a 4.5 because I think it gives me enough years that the fence will last. And if I had to replace a line post, it's not a deal breaker for me. But those brace and corner posts, I want to have big enough that they're really going to last. So that's how I made those decisions. I have my braces timing in at 3/4 of an hour. Driving my post at about 6 minutes for a line post, 8 minutes for a corner or a brace post. If you are first time fencing, this is not how long it's going to take you to drive a post. It's going to take longer, realistically, to get everything set up and figured out. And if you're a really good contractor, you can probably even go faster than this if you're in good soil. But you know, when we hit rock, it slows down, and this is just a rough estimate on the time. It does allow you to put in a cost per hour for your time. I think I have $15 in here, which is, you know, cheap. But I'm pretty cheap labor on the farm. Not in my paying job, but on the farm I can be pretty cheap. And then I have a cost in here for stapling the wire or the fabric up on that, and then unrolling and stretching it as well. So I have a bunch of times, plus I have a machinery cost that I can also include in this calculator. For the wood plank fence, this is the only fence that doesn't need a brace. There's no tension on this fence. It's just wood coming in. These are all done with actually the smaller line posts. We're not actually even doing the bigger posts here in this. When we see the cost here in a second, you'll see that it's still pretty expensive. But the one thing about this is that all of this cost is done for a fence that's untreated. So there's no painting being done, there's no maintenance being done. This is a high maintenance option. So not only is there a high upfront cost to putting in a plank fence, but there's a lot of maintenance costs associated with it, and that's not included in here. The beauty of a wood plank fence is that it's a very good visible barrier. A lot of times, even when we do working facilities for cattle and things like that, a lot of times we'll use boards in combination with wire, and that's because it's a really good visible barrier, and it's something that is solid and strong. So it does work well in that regard. I went ahead and put in a 4-board plank fence cost, and I have it a little over $650 a foot, $665, $666, $665. We'll go $665, that's a better number. And I went with a 4-board plank fence here, treated wood posts, and I think I have poplar, rough cut poplar as the planks on here. I went 4-board because I tell people all the time that a plank fence always has a board down. There's always one missing, and 3 boards will hold in an animal, but 2 doesn't. So I go 4 so that I know that while I'm maintaining it and there's only 3 boards up, I'm still okay. If you're trying to get someone to build any of these materials, these prices are not what they're going to charge you. This is just a good idea for you to figure out what your cost and time and energy is really going to be worth, and if you want to do it, and also to compare what they're charging versus what you think it would cost you to do it yourself.
Did that fence include painting?
No painting in that cost. No maintenance at all in that. And part of that is because you'd have it up for 6 months before you'd paint it anyway. You'd want it to breathe before you actually paint it. So I didn't put it in the initial cost. But you know, every few years that cost pops back up again with that type of fence. So not to be neglected. Woven wire, this is the traditional fencing that we see a lot of people anticipate building on a perimeter with a neighbor. Woven wire is a good physical barrier for those animals. And if you ever do get into disputes with neighbors, this is probably what's called for a lot of times for the type of fencing that you're going to be required to put in with a neighbor. Woven wire fence, by the nature, we're going to talk a little bit about high tensile wire and standard steel wires. The major difference between the two is that high tensile fence is built with a higher carbon steel. That higher carbon steel has memory to it. It means it bounces back. It doesn't stretch and then stay stretched like a traditional woven wire. And the high tensile wire also has less stretch in it. It has 1% as compared to about 10% in a standard woven wire. If I'm building a woven wire fence, I'm going to build that woven wire fence assuming that over time it's going to stretch, but I'm going to use larger wire in it because of the different characteristics of the metal used in this as compared to the 12.5 gauge wire that we can use in the high tensile wire. This is going to probably use number 9, at least on my top and bottom runs, and then a bigger wire typically in the center even than that 12.5 gauge. The cost on materials here is about $280 a foot, and labor here, I have it $1.50 a foot to drive those posts. I have my post spacing here every 12.5 feet. I need to have it if I'm doing NRCF specs currently at 14 feet. And the reason for that is because the way that this woven wire is built, the vertical members in the woven wire aren't continuous in the same way. When we talk about the fixed knot high tensile, it has a continuous vertical stay. Every piece of metal that goes vertical is continuous, and so it has a vertical structure in that fence. This fence does not have that type of structure because of the hinge joint on it. Each time we wrap, we have essentially a break. So we have different pieces of metal every time we go up vertically, and it doesn't hold itself up in the same way that the fixed knot high tensile does. So we have to have those posts about every 12.5, 14 feet to keep that fence standing upright and not sagging down. And we end up with about $4.30 a foot. Not what someone else would charge, but that's what I would charge myself if I was building it. Fixed knot high tensile looks almost exactly the same as a standard woven wire. And when we get out this afternoon, you'll get a really good chance to look at a fixed knot high tensile wire. This is a really interesting style. One of a couple things, it has that higher carbon steel in it, that memory. It doesn't tend to sag in quite the same way. It also has those vertical stays, which allows us to stretch out our post spacing. So one of the major benefits of this fixed knot high tensile is that we can move our post spacing out to 20 feet pretty comfortably with this type of, even up to 25 feet if we wanted to. And it depends a little bit on how the land lays where you need those posts to go, but we get away with significantly less posts in our design. And so our material costs come down a little bit under $2 as opposed to that $2.50 that we were looking at on the last fence. And the primary driver of that difference is not having as many posts in this line. The other thing worth noting here is that traditionally this type of fabric or wire that we would use on the fence would have been more expensive, but with the cost of steel going like it did, the actual weight of a roll, 330 feet of this, is actually lighter than a roll of the 9 gauge with the 11 gauge middle wires on a standard woven wire, and the costs have now come out so that this type of fencing is very cost comparable, sometimes even a little bit cheaper depending on where you're going to purchase it. And so we come out at a little under $3 a foot. Not bad. A standard high tensile fence is electrified. For the sake of argument here, we're not going to talk about a smooth wire, high tensile wire fence and not talk about electrifying it. This is, in theory, a psychological barrier. Jeremy's going to go into much more detail about it, but I don't see a reason to build a smooth wire fence and not electrify it other than a barbed wire fence. We would not electrify that one. Don't worry, Chris, I won't forget it today. The 5-stranded high tensile electrified fence, I have about $1,400 or $1.40 a foot for materials. This also allows us to go out on our spacing on our posts. I think I did this again, 25-foot wood posts on this type of fencing here. You could, in theory, actually stretch these wood posts out to 50 foot, but if I was doing this as a perimeter fence, I would want something in between every 50 feet. I wouldn't want to go quite that far without some sort of spacer on some regular spacing just for comfort. So I went ahead and just put it on 25s. I didn't put any posts in here other than wood posts in any of these designs. And so no steel posts, no fiberglass posts. I just went with straight wood, and I think 25 is a reasonable number here. The really nice thing about both this fence and the last one is I said those posts are on 25, but this fence is structurally controlled by our braces on the end, and if we had like a rock outcropping, we can move where those posts are very easily around so that we can space them opposite of those areas that we don't really want to drive. If we know we have one rocky area and then we have better areas, we can choose to put the posts into better areas without really affecting the structure of this fence, which is a nice benefit of the high tensile wire like this. And we come out at just around $2 a foot, which is not bad. I don't have the energizer, like I don't have the box in here to charge the fence, and I don't have the grounding system in here, but I did actually put in a cost for the different connectors that we would use rather than steeples that I have in the other styles of fence. And last but not least is a barbed wire fence. Most barbed wire at this point has also gone to high tensile, meaning that a lot of that structure is associated with the tension that we put on those braces on the end. The barbed wire, though, cannot be electrified, which means we have to go back to spacing our posts much more regularly. And I know we're going to talk about the law later on creeping through the fence, and you know that people will joke that animals don't creep through a fence, but if you literally have smooth wires that are only horizontal, animals can creep through the fence. It is possible. Even with barbed wire, they can figure out how to do it. And so we do need to keep our post spacing a little bit more regular with this barbed wire fence. And as a result, our material costs jump back up because we have to have more posts in the ground. And we end up at around $250, $260 a foot. So this actually is coming in at $260 a foot. The fixed not high tensile is at $290 a foot. And our smooth wire electrified fence is at $2 a foot. So we're really looking at this barbed wire, which traditionally people think of as the least expensive option, is not actually the least expensive option. It's sort of a middle ground. And a lot of times this barbed wire and the fixed not high tensile, depending on how we manage post spacing and some other things, can even be cost comparable. So it's worth doing your own investigation, because depending on when I do it, those costs end up looking very similar a lot of times.
What's the spacing on the post here?
12 and a half. I put them on 12 and a half again. NRCS says they have to be at least on 14s, but 12 and a half works much better into 25, into 1,000 foot. So I just go ahead and do everything on 12 and a half, because that's probably what I would do if I built it. Actually, what I do is I'd measure it and then I divide it out so that it came out under 14, but it'd probably be close to 12 in most cases. Post types, I did everything in here with treated wood posts, and there's no reason other than possibly having an organic operation where I needed something that was not treated to go in the ground, that I would choose a wood post that wasn't treated. There's nothing about purchasing an untreated wood post that makes a lot of sense economically. Steel T-posts are a pretty cost-effective thing to do, although they have definitely gone up in price as well in the last couple years. But if it was me and I was building a fence, I'd probably build it with wood, and then I would, if I had to replace line posts, I would use steels to do that. That's just sort of my preference. And if I was going in with any sort of electrified fence, then I would much prefer wood over steel. And these fiberglass ones, and what you'll see later today in the field from Jeremy, there's some pretty interesting things on the market that are not just a standard fiberglass post, that are also out there right now for putting in electrified fencing, which is kind of cool to see. Fence planning. If I am talking about fences and costs, you know, nothing that I've said here today was a cheap fence. There's nothing out there that's so cheap that you want to do it 8 times over. Like, it's expensive to build a fence. And so doing good planning before you start is really important, because the last thing you want to do is build a fence and then feel like you have to tear it out 5 years later because it's not where you want it. So being really intentional and really thinking about what size pastures and paddocks you're trying to make. And then I put this note in here about, do you need a variety of sizes? Because a lot of people don't instinctively want to make their fields different sizes. They want everything to be the same size. And there's 2 reasons you might not want to. One, you might have different quality of soils. You might have bottom ground that's much more productive, that you really don't need as many acres for them to graze the same number of days that you do on a hillside. And also, a lot of times people will have different size groups of animals that they're trying to manage. So they'll say, oh, I have this group of cows, but you also have 3 bulls that you pull out and you have them in there, 8 months of the year. And those bulls need to have somewhere to go. And it doesn't have to be the same size pasture that you put your 50 cows in. It might be a different size pasture. So really accounting for that, or if you have a weaning lot, that weaning lot doesn't necessarily have to be a full-size pasture, but it has to be built correctly and in the right spot. So all of those things need to be accounted for in the planning, and it's much better to do it before we start building permanent fence. One thing I do encourage people is, your perimeter fences are non-negotiable, because the animals leaving the farm is not a good thing. At the very least, create large pastures and good perimeter fences, and then use temporary fencing to create smaller areas to manage. That's nice for rotational systems. It's also nice to test an interior fence on a temporary or a semi-permanent basis before you put in a full-on permanent fence, to make sure that you're really comfortable with where you're planning to lay out that fence line. And there are a lot of options for doing temporary fencing as part of this. So a lot of times people will say, oh, I can't do it because I have small ruminants and those pigtails, they don't keep in my sheep or my goats or my alpaca. But there are a lot of different types on the market and different qualities of posts out there where you can adjust the height at which, it doesn't show up on any of those screens, the heights at which you would put in your temporary wire. And there's also a lot of different types of wires out there, from the tapes and the ribbons that are much more visible for animals that haven't been trained yet, down to the poly wires. Different options from visibility, different lifespans on those materials, but those materials are not meant to be permanent. They're not meant to last 20 years, so you shouldn't expect that kind of life from them. On the other hand, they're much more portable and much easier to maintain underneath. But they do have some conductivity issues. They're not nearly as conductive as the wire that we're going to see today, that 12.5 gauge high tensile steel wire.
Could you mention the colors of what is most recognizable?
Around here, we would absolutely recommend white over yellow. We have these seasonal droughts pretty regularly here in the late fall, and those yellow wires disappear. They're very hard to see. They're hard to UV stabilize. They don't tend to hold up structurally as well. Certainly the white ones tend to do better. And there are different qualities. You will see that. I mean, some people will call it turbo wire, or it'll be like a 9-strand versus a 6-strand poly wire. And all of those things will play into the quality of that wire and what you're going to get out of those materials. Energizer-wise, there's lots of different things on the market. There's solar ones, there's plug-ins that would go into an AC, and some people just even have battery-operated energizers or chargers. Jeremy's going to go in much more detail about it, but from a cost perspective, if you can plug in an AC unit, it's what you're going to want to do. It's definitely your best option from a cost perspective. And I think Jeremy's going to cover this as well, but I only touch on this because I have these alpacas, and you can see on mine that I actually have what's referred to here as a wire return, where I have a hot and a grounded wire. Really good for small ruminants. For most people, though, an earth return or a all-hot wire system is much better. And getting that grounding rate is really critical, and you mentioned already that grounding pub. I think that's really useful that we have that in there. This is where almost all electric fencing fails, is people say, oh, it doesn't work. Well, it doesn't work because it's not shocking the animals, and so getting the grounding rate is key to getting these animals to respect an electrified fence. Just one sort of last thought here, because this is about costs and types of fencing. If I was building any fence right now, and I have built quite a bit in the last couple years, I have a lot of fixed knot high tensile that I've put up on my perimeters with neighbors. And I have intentionally, instead of putting a barbed wire on the top, which is what most contractors want to do, I have electric wire on the top and on the inside of my fence. And I have it for 2 reasons. One, because I just spent a lot of money to put in fence, some with contractors and some myself, my own time and effort. And it's a major investment, and I would like it to last. And I don't want my bulls and my cows to rub on it, in the spring when they're trying to get that hair off. And hot wire does keep them from doing that. Honestly, it does a better job than barbed wire does. And 2, it also gives me a supply of electricity anywhere in the field, so I don't have to set up a solar and a temporary grounding system to run a temporary fencing system somewhere in my fields. And that has been really nice to not have to constantly go out and figure out where to ground and figure out where to set up a box and move it all the time. Having that power everywhere is really useful. So with that, I would take any questions.
Any questions for Morgan?
I'm the tech art for area for NRCS, and I know you quoted, referenced our NRCS standard quite a bit, so I just want to make you aware that our standard has recently changed.
Yes.
Just in the last month or so. It's pretty easy to find online. You just Google a field office tech guide and find that new standard. I can't
Yeah, it's absolutely excellent. And the ones I'm referencing are the newer ones. The older ones would have allowed for any smooth wire to be at 14-foot spacing, and now with the electrification, we can space out to 50 feet, which is tremendously helpful from a cost standpoint for people that are on contract if they're negotiating their contracts, but absolutely, you should go and review them because the new ones look really nice. Yeah. Yeah, they just came out, I think November 1, didn't they? I think it was.
We're gonna put all these available online electronically, and we'll put the new standards in the electronic.
Yeah, but thank you, because it's a pretty significant change. We're really happy about them, so. Yeah. It's not actually in the law section. We don't electrify barbed wire because animals get caught in it. And I think I did the same conversation on Tuesday, and I said I have two small children. I have a 1-year-old and a 3-year-old, and I have a lot of electricity on my farm, and I'm not really afraid that they're going to hit an electric fence and get shocked. It's going to happen. It has happened. It will happen again. They're not that smart. It's okay. But what I'm not hoping to do is have them get caught in an electric fence and get stuck, continuously getting shocked, because I don't want to be the one to pull them out. And realistically, we're trying to train the animal. We're not trying to punish them indefinitely. And with the barbs, we get things stuck. In most cases, it's not going to kill anything. The way that power is built, it's unlikely to really, but it is dangerous. It's just not the ideal standard, yeah. And it also creates some weird charges on those barbs. Go ahead.